Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healer specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally grateful to be here. Thanks for asking how I am, Rory. And we're wondering how you are. You've tuned into the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We hope you are well. This is episode 279. 3 stops, 3 topics that we're going to be covering today, starting off with the first stop at Student Services, where we recognise the journey of a student. And today we're going to be speaking a little bit about complicated grief, what that may look like. And then we go into our ethical, sustainable practice, the section of the podcast where we recognise those that are in private practice, and that so often the skills we need to be in private practice and running a therapy business are not taught in our core training. And today we're going to be talking about the topic of accreditation. What are the pros? What are the cons of that? Then we go into Practice Matters. That's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where today we're exploring your why. Why did you become a counsellor or a psychotherapist? And of course, we have a special guest that Rory has invited, and that is Sinead Oskun, who's going to be guiding us through that. But starting us off in those student services, Rory, complicated grief. And I think as we kind of cover this, it's unlikely, I guess, that a student would be expected to work with complicated grief. But I think it's important that we kind of can recognize what it may look like and kind of some of the characteristics of how one might work with this, with the correct training.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And you are right. Hopefully, I say hopefully, someone who's in a placement probably wouldn't get allocated a client with complicated grief. And the reason for that is complicated grief is very, very different in its presentation to ordinary grief. And it even sounds a little bit cruel, doesn't it, to kind of start to separate different forms of grief. But the fact of the matter is that complicated grief is really linked to depression, and it really is a long-term grief. And usually it's worked with very specific practitioners. But I think if you are a student and you are presented with this in the therapy room, it will give you some idea of what it would look like, and also how you may decide, possibly to refer on to a more experienced practitioner or some other form of services. So I guess we start by saying, what is complicated grief? And I think it's best summed up as a stuckness, where people are stuck in their grief, and it's sometimes referred to as a prolonged grief, where intense, long-lasting symptoms of grief, together with ongoing problems and difficulties in coping with life, go on for more than 6 months after somebody dies. And it even feels very difficult putting an arbitrary time on grief. But I think the 6 months is that where the intensity of those feelings is still as raw, is still as present, and people just cannot move on. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. That, I think, is a good indicator of complex or complicated grief, Ken.
Yeah, and what you're speaking about there is the indicator, that complicated grief of maybe somebody not being able to shift that grief, for it being as raw as it used to be. And of course, that we might see down the line, but we can start to spot the signs of complicated grief in the earlier stages as well. So basically, complex grief often shows itself around adverse circumstances. So we may be talking about a very sudden or a very traumatic event that leads to somebody's death. And this can very much complicate the grief process. It kind of affects the bereaved person's grief trajectory, as we say. And an example of this from not too long ago here in the United Kingdom and most of the world was COVID-19 deaths. They came out of the blue kind of things, and it wouldn't be surprised if we saw somebody presenting years later within therapy with still linked to complicated grief around a COVID-19 loss. It would be understandable. Or any kind of sudden death, so natural disasters. It may be war or terror attacks, and we don't need to look far. We look to the news at our world at the moment. We can understand that people going through terrible atrocities, losing loved ones, this can greatly complicate the grieving cycle. It's not a natural process. It's something that has come along unexpectedly and quite traumatically. And I think that kind of gives us an understanding of where we might see, what we might see as the clues to kind of guide us that this may be complicated grief. It may be someone who lost somebody in a traffic accident, or a family member who takes their own life can lead to this complicated grief, Rory. I think that hopefully kind of, and of course there are other examples, but it kind of indicates what it may look like in the early stages. But as you've said, Rory, in its later stages, it's just not the person not being able to shake off that grief. It's still with them, still raw, still in their thoughts, still invading their waking moments, Rory.
Yes, invading their waking moments and permeating their sleeping, their sleeping time. And you are right. Things like family conflicts, where someone's had a fallout with a member of the family, and then that person has died and never be able to resolve those issues. And also, I think one thing sometimes we overlook, people with existing mental health conditions, people who are struggling with things like schizophrenia or bipolar or clinical depression, and then they lose a loved one, that can compound their grief and get them into this area of real stuckness. I think the other thing is that sometimes we talk about mummification. And mummification is where people build shrines, refuse to clear the rooms out of the person that's died. Recently, Mr. Al Fayed, the very famous owner of Harrods, whose son Dodie died in the car crash with Lady Diana Spencer, he kept his apartment for years untouched, literally untouched. The cleaner had to put everything back as it was when Mr. Al Fayed's son left that fateful day. So mummification is a really good indication, and I think that more people find themselves in complicated grief than perhaps we know. I've certainly met people, not in a professional capacity, but just on a day-to-day basis, where it's quite clear that someone has, they talk about a bereavement, and you think, oh, it must be quite recent, and you realise it was 10, 12, 15 years ago.
Yeah. Oh, very much so, and it's difficult to put a time frame on grief. I've certainly experienced grief in my own life from many decades ago, and there is still, I guess, elements of that are with me today. However, I'm able to live with it. It doesn't invade my every moment. It's not in my head all the time. If I'm going through maybe some old photographs and I see a photograph, I may have a tear, but there's almost a warmth and acceptance to that person not being around anymore. So kind of putting a timeline on things is tricky, but there's a great handout that will kind of point you to that in a moment. And in the handout, it suggests that normally grief will start to kind of go down slightly around 6 to 12 months. The person will still be sore. Of course they will. They've lost somebody, but we would see them not having their day-to-day invasion of these feelings and all the symptoms coming up. I mean, when I say symptoms, it's kind of what are the reactions that we might see somebody going through, and of course it can show itself in depression, despair, dejection, anxiety, fears, preoccupation with the thoughts of the person that is no longer around, almost intrusive thoughts where they're not sitting to think about that person, but that is just invading their day-to-day. There may be agitation in day-to-day interaction, restlessness, unable to sleep or wanting to sleep far too much, loss of appetite, low energy, physical complaints. So that it can show itself in a lot of ways, but kind of when the person is presenting in therapy, we won't need to look very far before they start mentioning the person that they'd lost. And it may give us indicators or point us in the direction of looking and asking ourselves, because I think this is what this is about. Could this be complicated grief that I'm seeing here in my therapy room right now?
One of the ways of thinking about that is, if somebody's unable to do the day-to-day things, go shopping, get themselves dressed, maybe even attendance at therapy. I mean, I think that's a good indication if people just don't turn up or turn up, very late or, spasmodically, just don't turn up on a regular basis. And I think, one of the ways of working with this very complicated grief is trying to map support for somebody, trying to maybe make a referral to support systems, maybe organizations that offer group support, that type of thing. And obviously, if someone's got a mental health issue, thinking very carefully, maybe talking over with your supervisor, what would be the best course of action to support someone. Certainly if they're, I think with complicated grief, if someone's struggling with an ongoing mental health issue, it's probably going to get a little worse in my experience. So maybe gently, maybe suggest they go and see the doctor. It may be that if they're taking medication, the medication needs to be adjusted. Not something that a therapist can prescribe, I have to say, but it's about mapping as much support as possible. And I've also found that in my experience, people who are kind of isolated tend to be present more with complicated grief because they haven't got a support system. So, doing that mapping support piece, I think is just really essential, Ken.
Yeah, very much so. And the reason this topic going into student services, as we mentioned at the beginning, is to kind of maybe identify this and recognize that need to refer on. Looking over the handout that you've provided for this, Rory, it's very clear that a specialist intervention is required, a specialist way of working once we recognize that complicated grief. And there is research that kind of indicates what may move a person from this, from the feelings of this complicated grief. And acceptance and commitment therapy is perhaps an avenue. And the reason for that is the acceptance that the person is no longer around, that they have gone, that it was a traumatic and terrible event that happened, that it was so unexpected, is a good starting point to be able to accept, okay, it is as it is. And then the commitment part of acceptance and commitment therapy is that commitment to get over this in some way, to not forget that person, but to move away from the intense pain that kind of interacts with the person on a day-to-day basis. Accepting that it's okay to be sad within grief, recognizing that in self and allowing that time, and the person being able to see a positive future ahead. And very often with the complicated grief, we'll see a lack of any vision of any future without this person. I don't know how I can live without them. I can't live without them. I'm not able to cope without this person being around. I'm not able to live with this guilt I'm feeling that I didn't make amends with this person before they were taken away. Those are the kind of things that we might see that would indicate that specialist intervention. And I think you're 100% right, Rory. The best place to start is with your supervisor, and on the recommendation of your supervisor. If you're working within a placement, within an agency, have a look. What are your referral pathways? And is there a referral pathway? Maybe working with your practice manager within your placement. How might you manage that referral onto somebody that will be able to hold that person and give them the support that they need in this very, very specialist area, Rory?
Yes, and I think, one of my final thoughts on this is that we're going to see a lot of complicated grief because of the wars that we're seeing at the current time. I'm talking about Ukraine, I'm talking about the Middle East, where people may be dispersed and, are here in the UK and they're thinking of their relatives, their homeland, that type of thing. And I think we're going to see a rise in complicated grief because it comes down, I think, to some extent to a lack of control. That when people are displaced, that adds to that sense of a lack of control, and it can speak to complicated grief. And you're right, acceptance and commitment therapy can a mild form of CBT. It finds its roots in cognitive behavioural therapy. Can be very helpful for complicated grief, as can encouraging clients to get into a routine, even if it's just a routine of going to the shop once a day, or phoning up a friend or something like that, just to gain them that control. And also self-compassion. A lot of people with complicated grief incredibly blame themselves. If I'd have just done this, if I'd have just done that. And I think the promotion of self-compassion is certainly a route to at least ameliorating the harsher edges of what is a very difficult place that people find themselves in.
Very, very much so. And we have a handout for you on this. It's one of Rory's super duper handouts called Complicated Grief. You can get that. There's no cost to this. You just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, find episode 279, and there within that page is the download Complicated Grief. Just pop the email address in there of where we should send it, and that will be in your inbox. And looking over this handout, Rory, I always study your handouts before we have a chat. They definitely inform how our conversation goes. But one of the things that really stood out with this handout is the length of the references. There's close on 2 pages of references and 3 pages of handout where we're kind of covering the topic, and then 2 pages just of references. It's reference after reference after reference, backing up and kind of evidence basing what is covered in this handout. And I think just looking at the references shows me what a specialist area this is, Rory, an important area. And maybe, if you are a student, maybe a consideration when you graduate to look into this area for further study, because as you said, Rory, it is definitely on the rise, I guess, in a world where we find a lot of turmoil. It kind of lends itself to that more complicated grief. And that is today's Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your counselling tutor discount. That's counselingskillsacademy.com. And as we kind of back out of student services into ethical, sustainable practice, recognizing you, the practitioner who has started their own private practice, today we're saying, what about accreditation? Should you become accredited? What are the pros? What are the cons, Rory?
Yes, well, this is something that's come up a lot in our Facebook group recently. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, just a kindly reminder to go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group. We'll let you in, and you can see the conversations, the interesting and fascinating conversations that play out within the Facebook group. And one of the conversations was about accreditation. So let me just set the scene for this. What we're talking about really primarily is the UK here, because different countries will have different forms of accreditation. So Ken and myself are going to be speaking about the UK, and we're going to be speaking about practitioners who've qualified from a course. So here in the UK, level 4, or for our friends in Scotland who have a slightly different qualification route, it's level 8, I think. And it's usually a diploma in counselling. That's the minimum. A diploma of counselling, which has been taken through a known awarding body such as SEG or CPCAB or COSCA in Scotland, and it's been conducted at a classroom. A lot of online courses that don't get you to where you need to be. And once you qualify, and when you get your diploma, you're technically a qualified counsellor. Let be no mistake about that. You're a qualified counsellor. You can say you're a qualified counsellor, and you can set up in private practice. So that leads us on to accreditation. And what accreditation is that a lot of practitioners join professional bodies like the BACP, the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, Association of Christian Counsellors. And you can, if you wish, go for accreditation. And what that is that you submit a piece of work. Usually it's a supervisor's report. Usually it's a case study. There's lots of other areas that are asked for in accreditation, and you submit it. And if you pass, this is what is technically an exam, you can become accredited. Now, to do this, you need to pay a fee. Most ethical bodies or professional bodies will ask you for a fee. And I think in the case of the BACP, your membership subscription goes up if you're accredited. I think it goes up about £20 a year. So the question in front of us is why someone would want to do that. Someone might choose to become accredited. And one of the reasons is that if you work for National Health Service or you work for a lot of employment assistance programs, they may very well ask for accreditation. They may very well say you need to be working towards it, because part of being accredited is you have to do, I think, 450 hours for most bodies of practice before you can even go for accreditation. So you need 450 client hours. And so for some jobs, accreditation is the routine. You have to have, or you have to be working towards accreditation. So that's one reason, I guess, to go for accreditation, Ken.
Yeah, very much so. And you might see that in job advertisements asking for accreditation or working towards accreditation. And as you've said, Rory, it is a process, and it is a process that here in the UK you will undertake via your ethical body. And I understand why it is in place, because we have many different routes into becoming a counsellor. And you mentioned a number of the different awarding bodies. So these are bodies that oversee the study process and the examination process to make sure that you hold the knowledge to become that counsellor and to step into practice. And on finishing a recognised course here in the United Kingdom, as you said, Rory, you can go into practice. You can see clients. You are now a counsellor. What the ethical bodies are saying is, this is great. You are now a counsellor. Get out there, get some experience. And you mentioned 450 hours. And of course, you'd need to look to your ethical body to see what the requirements are for you. But But there is an example. So maybe 450 hours in, you're going to be maybe very different to how you were when you first stepped into practice. You may have learned a lot. The clients will teach us a lot. You will have done CPD. You may even have done specialist training to go into certain niches, like we spoke about complicated grief in our last section. You may have studied that and be working with that client group. You're going to be a more mature, established counsellor. And I get the ethical bodies want to kind of acknowledge that. They want to acknowledge that experience and that commitment to what you are studying, that ongoing commitment. And you go through a process, and then that process equals what is called accreditation. So I understand why it is there. I understand specifically now, and we're speaking again in the United Kingdom, there is a topic called ScopeEd, which kind of indicates where you might be able to work, or where your competences would be best fit. And of course, accreditation is part of that process. And of course, you'd need to go and look up ScopeEd to fully understand what that looks like and how it applies to you. But the other side of the coin is there are many that choose not to go for accreditation. So we've looked at some of the pros, and they will maybe choose not to go for accreditation. Maybe they're not working within the NHS or within an area in counselling where there is a requirement. So there is no employer saying you need to be accredited or working towards. The practitioner may say, you know what, I've never been asked by any client whether I am accredited or not. And I certainly wasn't when I was in practice. It was never anything that was asked. So I guess it's about what suits you best, Rory, suits you as the practitioner best. It's a decision to make.
Yes, and I think as part of being a presenter on the podcast, one has to present all the areas, all the voices that talk about accreditation, and there are some who say that accreditation just adds more cost and more stress to them. They've already qualified. Why do they have to justify themselves again? Why do they have to pay more? There's an unfairness that they have to jump through even more hoops to get work, and I would acknowledge that. And you mentioned the scoped framework, the scope of education, which is an initiative that I think 6 ethical bodies in the UK have signed up to, and effectively it's A, B, and C. And to get into column B, one route, and I want to be very clear on this, one route is accreditation. However, there has been talk of getting into that column B by experience and qualification, and I've not seen any reference to it recently. So, I would think about that. In my experience, clients really don't ask for accreditation. They don't even ask for your qualifications. They just want help. I used to take all my qualifications in when I was practicing, and I used to say, you can see my qualifications if you like. And not one of them. Oh, sorry, one when I was working with a child, their parents wanted to see my qualifications, but no one else ever has. I've worked for an EAP who never wanted accreditation. However, a lot do. And also, there are people who just feel that it kind of validates their experience, that they go for accreditation, and when they get it, they feel like they've accomplished something. And I don't think we should diminish, people's achievements. But I think at the moment it's a very much debated area. Should I go for accreditation? Should I not go for accreditation? And I think for lots of people, it's a personal choice. I think for others, it's one that they have to do, because if they want to get employment with a certain employer, they're going to have to get it. And, no matter how much we wish that things were different, I guess we have to just kind of work with the world as it is, Ken.
Yeah, very much so, as it is, and as it is changing, and it is ever changing, of course. When you were speaking about scoped, or I pronounce it ScopeEd, I don't know why, I just do.
Well, that's the correct way of pronouncing it, Ken.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's the scope of education, isn't it?
I see, okay.
Scope of education, so you're correct.
Oh,
yeah.
Thanks for that, Rory. That wasn't around, 2 years ago from when we're making this podcast. So we need to look at the landscape. It is forever changing. And I recognize, Rory, you speaking about working for an EAP, and they may even have changed who they would work with now. It does, and it's about looking at who are you, what is your career journey? And we've looked in ethical, sustainable practice before about what are your niche areas, what are your plans, what is your business plan for moving forward, and is accreditation something that will benefit you? And I guess there's the do I just do it anyway in case I might need it one day? And these are all personal choices that you need to make. So we have no, I guess, standing on either side of this. We look at both sides of the coin, and I guess that's what we do in Counselling Tutor, and certainly on this podcast. We say often we are not the experts. We're not here to advise and guide you. We're two peers having a conversation about topics that are current and that come up in our Facebook group. And I think just to kind of end this, we'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this. Accreditation, not accreditation, your personal view for your personal journey, and a great place to be part of that conversation. Go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, as Rory said. Come and join the conversation. We want to hear from you.
Yes, absolutely, and it is a bit of a hot topic. But pop your comments in the Facebook group, and let's see what the community says about it. For some people, it's a route to getting more sustainable work. And for some people, there's a principal position of saying, no, I'm not paying any more money to justify my professionalism, because I've already had my professionalism assessed when I qualified for my course. And I think both of those are equally ethical positions to take. And for the record, I'm not accredited. I never went down the accreditation route. However, one of the things I would observe is that in 2014, the ethical body that I was a member of asked everybody to get insurance, and also they changed the constitution so that you could be audited. And that was something that only accredited counsellors experienced. If you're accredited before 2014, then you would have to have insurance. You'd have to, maybe be audited, maybe asked about your practice. But if you weren't accredited, you weren't. And 2014, the kind of landscape changed. And within ethical frameworks, you have to now have liability insurance if you practice, certainly privately, and also you can be audited by your ethical body. And that took a big chunk of what being accredited was out and placed it into those non-accredited people. So I was actually being asked to do things, which I did anyway, that previously someone who was accredited would only do. So the landscape's changing, and as I say, Ken, the landscape's changing rapidly in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. It seems that every day there's a new initiative, a new idea, and of course we're eagerly awaiting what the next iteration of the ethical frameworks are, which will probably be out in sometime in 2024, I'm understood. So get that conversation started. What do you think about accreditation?
The complexities of running an ethical, sustainable practice. And of course, keep tuning into the Counselling Tutor podcast. We'll keep you up to date with what we find. And that kind of brings us now onto our Practice Matters section. This is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast. Make sure you write it down in your CPD tracker, just listening to the podcast. Anything that you do in service of your clients, in service of your practice, can count as CPD. And today, Rory, you spoke to our special guest, Sinead Oskun, on exploring the why. And that why is so important. We've spoken about it before. It can be a tough road being a counsellor, being a psychotherapist, specifically at student level. Many may consider stopping their study journey because it is really, really tough. And having a strong why, your reason that called you into doing this, is a great place to go when you have those kind of moments, Rory.
Yes, I was very grateful for Sinead reaching out to us. Sinead, unusually for this section, is a student. just about to qualify and become a qualified counsellor. But she gives a very powerful overview of why she became a counsellor, and also the benefits of working as a volunteer for some time if one can. And when we talked about that, fair warning, this piece does talk a little bit about child bereavement, but we caught up with Sinead, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
I'm delighted to be interviewing Sinead Oskun, who is a student counsellor doing an integrative degree. I think you're in your third year now, so you're just on the road to qualifying. And you wrote to me about the importance of the why, and maybe why it's important that when people train as counsellors, they may do some volunteering, or maybe qualified counsellors may want to do some volunteering, maybe just to oil the wheels of society. So, Sinead, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Rory. It's lovely to be here with you.
Yes. So what was it that kind of compelled you to get in contact?
So, as you mentioned, I hear you and Ken regularly talk about the whys of counselling, and I think it resonated with my own story. So my own why came from the experience I had of the loss of my youngest daughter in 2015. So she died during birth. And at that time, my life was going pretty well. I think my biggest concern at the time was how I'd help my children adjust to life with a new sister. Didn't have anything on the radar that something like that might happen. And so it threw our lives upside down, certainly threw my well-being upside down. And in that time of grief was when I first came into contact, I guess, with counselling. So I sought counselling from Child Bereavement UK at the time. Child Bereavement UK were absolutely amazing, gave me a chance to voice what I felt at the time other people wouldn't be able to hear. I think the real depths of my grief and the impact of that on my children, myself, my relationships, who I felt I was. But also it gave me a chance to, I guess, get a wider idea of what counselling was and what that might look like in my wider life. I really felt that it might be something that eventually I'd like to do. At the time, I wasn't anywhere near that, but I had that deep feeling that actually maybe this is something that I'd like to follow, and maybe this is something that I'd be good at, feel fulfillment from doing. Again, it wasn't a good 4 or 5 years before I was able to do that, before I was able to even think about doing that. But then I applied for a counselling course and set that journey in motion. And part of contacting you was, as part of my counselling journey, I started volunteering with a number of organisations. So I volunteered with Mind at first while I was doing my level 3. Mind were amazing in terms of opening that door of what volunteering could look like and support could look like. So my local Mind, I was supporting on the helplines as a befriender, but also supporting with their allotment where people came to seek support with their mental health, and also with the singing group that they had, just to add additional support there. And then going on to the degree, I debated which course to follow, whether I'd go and do a master's because I was self-funding, so the master's financially made more sense, or whether I'd do a level 5. And the master's, I did wrestle with it, but it felt as if I was going away from the core reason why I was doing counselling in the first place, which was about child bereavement and supporting families who'd experienced the sudden expected death of a baby or a child. And so I decided I'd do the level 5, swallow the costs of the self-funding, do the level 5. And whilst I was doing the level 5, I started befriending for the Lullaby Trust, which is an organisation who raises awareness and researches into sudden unexpected infant death, or SIDS. They provide information for safer sleep, but also they do a lot of bereavement support for families who have experienced a sudden unexpected infant death of a child.
Yes, I think that hearing the origin story of the why someone wants to become a therapist is always fascinating. And I think as a supervisor, it can give me, if I'm working with a supervisee, certainly a new supervisee, I may ask them why they became a therapist and what motivated them. And I think understanding the why, certainly if you're a supervisor, is really helpful in understanding the motivations of your supervisee, but not only that, being able to support them, because I'm a great believer, and I don't know what your view is on this, but I'm a great believer in that you should really, where possible, I know we don't live in an ideal world, but where possible, try to volunteer in areas that are meaningful to us. Try and do our placement hours in places that are meaningful for us, so that not only are you getting your hours, but you're investing yourself in that. But I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Absolutely, Rory. I completely agree. So my time at Mind was amazing. As I said, it opened that door, opened that mindset of wanting to support people. But when I started volunteering with the Lullaby Trust, I really felt that deep connection. As you know, when you're training to be a counsellor, the PD work at time can be really tough as you get into grips with kind of a deeper understanding of self, and that deeper awareness of self can feel quite disorientating at times as you readjust to where you fit in this new understanding of your world. And when I was volunteering, befriending, supporting other bereaved mums, I really believe that contact with my why on a weekly basis kept me grounded and kept me moving forwards, understanding why I was exactly doing this. It gave me that really important connection that kept me on the right path. But also, I think, Rory, which I think ties in with your what you were saying about being a supervisor, it also gave me that motivation to make sure my own well-being was in a good place at the time, to give me that motivation to invest in myself. So whilst I was doing my counselling training, seeking my own, which we need to do as part of the course anyway, but seeking my own therapy as part of that felt something that I really wanted to invest in. And so I very much tied the type of therapy that I was going to partake in with the befriending role, and I guess the more trauma element of what it's like to be bereaved of a child. So I did EMDR for mine, which I found fascinating, but it very much again tied in with that experience of supporting other parents, but also my own experience of what it was like to experience the death of a child, the unexpected death of my daughter Asra. And then in regards to placement, so my placement again is something that's tied in with my why. So I've been really fortunate to seek a placement with a charity that's local to me called Love Jasmine, which again is a charity that's set up by a bereaved couple, Kathy and Rob, in memory of their daughter Jasmine. They support adults and siblings who've experienced the sudden unexpected death of a child. Children can be babies, they can be adults, they support the full range through. But by working with Kathy and Rob, again, it's that deep connection with my why and the appreciation of what grief is like for very different people, because as we know, grief can be affected by all different kind of things, the way we grieve, from our socioeconomic background to our past history to our cultural beliefs, all sorts of things. Even our health can impact the way we grieve. And so by doing my placement with them, I've got a deeper understanding of that aspect of it as well. And one of the lovely things about Kathy and Rob is that they really invest in the students that are supporting them and also the counsellors that work for them. So they only take on bereaved parents because of that shared understanding and lived experience that they can offer. But for me, they pay for my counselling supervision as a kind of way to acknowledge the work that I'm doing for them. But also they offer all of the counsellors and their students a use of their therapeutic offerings as well, so that we can focus on our well-being as well. So very much that connection for why is supporting my development, whilst I'm also able to support them at the same time. There's a really lovely sense of community by following that why.
I mean, you've outlined very poignantly your journey into becoming a counsellor and that very strong why. I wonder when you qualify, and when you qualify, in the next year, as undoubtedly you will, I'm no doubt about that. But will your why stay the same? Do you think that will inform you as a qualified practitioner?
It's hard to say, Rory. At the moment, my why is amazingly fulfilling in that I feel excited about my daily work. I feel excited about my work with the Lullaby Trust. I feel excited when I go into placement. I feel excited when I am studying. But also I feel like there's a huge amount of growth at the moment. So every day at the Lullaby Trust, there's unique opportunities for growth. And I'm supported really well to do that. So for me, it's so fulfilling at the moment that I can't envisage it not being like this. But I know through my life that my life's followed amazing courses that I've never envisaged also. So recently, as part of my job in the Lullaby Trust, we've developed a resource, a trauma resource for people who've experienced an unexpected death. As part of that research and look into that, I've become really interested in trauma. My first degree was in biological sciences, so human biological science. There's a huge amount that was to do with neurology and the interconnection of that background from my kind of human biology side in terms of endocrinology and neurology and how hormones and the neurological system work, and understanding about trauma in the body and how that works is also really fascinating. My background was in teaching, so also I've got a huge appreciation and love for children. And certainly in the later years of my teaching career, I could see how trauma was entering the classroom, not just trauma of the children, but trauma of the parents as well. And so that generational trauma is something that I'm also really interested in. So whether they all combine to form a direction to go in, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm always willing to keep my doors open, because I know in the past that things that I've not 100% expected have always ended up being quite a beautiful path to follow. So
it sounds like there's a little bit of serendipity in your journey, as exactly. Mark Twain would remark. Let's have a look what's around this corner. It might just be wonderful.
Exactly. Exactly. And in terms of volunteering with the Lullaby Trust, so when I came in as a mum befriender, nowhere in my concept was the idea that I might eventually work for the Lullaby Trust. It was a sense of giving back in a meaningful way of something that I've experienced myself to support other parents in those dark moments. But as you mentioned with serendipity and kismet, I very much fell into the role. That's what it felt like. And I feel quite blessed that I'm in that role now in a way which I'm able to meet those whys every day, but also honour my own journey as well as supporting other people. So that honouring of what I've been through, my own loss, but the learning that's occurred because of that loss. My daughter, I get to carry all of that with me every day and see the massive impact it has on families.
I can hear how your own personal journey informs your practice, and I'm sure that it informs the contacts and the work you have with clients and those who you befriend in the other areas of your work. I wonder, there's a huge conversation that's going on now within therapy, and therapists are talking about it more and more. And that's of course the vexed issue of being paid fairly for work. And at Counselling Tutor, we've always said that qualified practitioners should be paid fairly for the work that they do. They work very hard. They've incurred costs. They incur ongoing costs for things like supervision, insurance, professional membership. Do you think that there is a place for qualified, experienced therapists, if they can, and not everybody can, to still volunteer and offer their services in a different aspect in terms of things like befriending? Well, I wonder what your view is on that.
So I think they can. We've had very many befrienders, and at the Lullaby Trust, we invest a lot in our befrienders in terms of time and development. So the initial training goes into a lot of those core conditions that we use in counselling. Whilst there is a huge distinction and a clear distinction between what befriending is, so volunteering, and what counselling is, there are many skills that can be honed and used during befriending. So, for example, the core conditions form the bedrock, but also the boundaries. And we provide continual development in that. So in terms of somebody who's newly starting out, if they felt that they wanted chances to develop, then there will be a place for that. But also in terms of the sense of community and connection, many of our befrienders report a massive sense of well-being from what they're doing and seeing the ongoing support that they're giving. So our befrienders come from a wide range of life, some from counselling backgrounds, some from counselling courses, others from other medical professions, some that are retired. There's a huge range, but many of them have reported having professional developmental opportunities and promotion as a result of befriending with the Lullaby Trust and the support they receive. We do a monthly newsletter which goes out, which the befrienders are welcome to chip into. And in that, they're welcome to make suggestions for areas that they'd like to develop further. And so they're very much supported in it. And I'm sure other organisations where people might be able to follow their whys and volunteer would have a similar ethos.
It's just struck me, listening to that final part of your response, that, people pay for CPD. You may want to go on a course and do CPD for bereavement, but actually there's so much value in doing qualitative work where you're actually engaging with specific client groups, not as a counsellor, but as a befriender, and you're obviously going to get training. You're obviously going to get more insights into what goes on. In terms of working with in your case, working with families of bereaved children. And it sounds to me like there may be a parallel CPD opportunity here, that someone who took on maybe a short engagement as a befriender could gain insights into a specific area of therapy, which they may not get through doing a CPD course.
Completely. And because we don't have set expectations of our befrienders. So I know some organisations to cover the cost of training, etc., say, if you're going to apply to volunteer with us, we expect this number of hours, this many times a week, or for this long after the training, you need to be enrolled with us. We don't, because our befrienders are made up of other bereaved family members. We understand that the emotional connection to that role is such that well-being is critical. So we will only ever offer a befriender the number of befriending hours that they feel happy and comfortable with. And we're always willing to accept a no. So when somebody feels like their life is busy in other areas, or it's coming up to anniversaries or other things, then we happily pull back and give them the space that they need. So in terms of balancing well-being with their own professional development, with that sense of being able to give back societally, especially to a group that they feel so connected to through their own lived experience, it's really enriching. And when we have our yearly face-to-face get-togethers where we deliver some more training, but we do some kind of enrichment activities as well, the atmosphere in the room when we've got all of our befrienders and our support team together is phenomenal. The sense of community and belonging, the sense that everybody in that room has taken something so heart-wrenching and they're turning it into something so positive and so enriching to other people's lives is just amazing, Rory. It's like working with the very best of humanity every day. I feel really privileged to be in this role.
Well, I think on that joyous statement, working with the very best of humanity, will bring the interview to an end. Maybe if you're listening to this and you are a qualified practitioner, you've got interest and you may have a why that you want to, an itch you want to scratch. Maybe befriending is a way of getting really high quality CPD through a different route, to be able to see a different aspect as opposed to a kind of training aspect, a theoretical aspect, more qualitative aspect. It just leaves me to thank you very much. So Sinead Oskun, thank you so much for joining us and best of luck with your studies going forward.
Big thank you to Sinead. Big thank you to you, Rory, for holding those interesting conversations and sharing those with us here on the Counselling Tutor Podcast. This is the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You've just listened to episode 279.
Yes, we started off with student services and complicated grief, an opportunity to identify what it is. And maybe if you have got a client with complicated grief, maybe idea of what it looks like, and also maybe if the referral pathway is needed. Off we went to ethical, sustainable practice, where we had a discussion about the very thorny issue of accreditation. Should we become accredited or should we not become accredited? And then finally, in Practice Matters, we spoke to Sinead Oskun, exploring the why, the motivation for becoming a counsellor. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not give us a 5-star review on the platform that you're listening to this. If you're listening on iTunes, why don't you just put a comment and give us a 5-star review? That'd be lovely. And also share us on your social media platforms. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.